Emily stood alone in the shattered tribunal, her knees aching from the cold marble floor, the remnants of the once grand hall surrounding her like ghosts of a forgotten past. The crowd's murmurs and whispers swirled around her, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. She had been abandoned here, cast aside by those who thought her weak, who thought she would break under their judgment. But Emily wasn't going to break. Not today. Not anymore. She lifted her chin, staring down the council members who looked at her with disdain. Their sneers were like daggers, but they only fueled the fire inside her. She had no scent, no mark of an omega to guide a mate. But she had her spirit, her will, and that would have to be enough. The floor beneath her feet groaned, as if it too shared in her sorrow. She had heard the rumors, seen the glances that followed her as if she were something broken, discarded, unworthy. But today, they would all see her for what she was, someone who would not be silenced. The Alpha King, Alexander Thorne, had yet to speak, his piercing silver eyes watching from the shadows. But even without his words, the weight of his presence was unmistakable. He had watched her from the moment she had stepped into this place, his gaze unblinking, filled with something unreadable. And now, with the tribunal at its peak, she stepped forward, challenging the very system that sought to break her. "You mock me," Emily's voice rang out, clear and defiant. "You think you know me, think you understand me, but you don't. You've never given me a chance. I've spent my life proving my worth to those who would never see me. But today, I challenge you. I challenge all of you to prove I am wrong." The council members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, some unsure, others eager to tear her down further. They had expected a plea, a cry for mercy, but not this. Not defiance. Not strength. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she did not waver. She was not here to beg. She was here to fight for herself, to show them the power of what they had overlooked. Alexander Thorne, the Alpha King, stood silent as ever, his towering figure like a stone monument in the corner of the room. His presence was commanding, and though he said nothing, his eyes locked with hers. A shiver ran down her spine, but not from fear. It was something else, something deeper. Emily could feel it, an unspoken connection, a pull she couldn't deny. As she stood before the council, every ounce of her being screamed to move forward, to demand what she had never asked for. But she knew that this moment was bigger than her. Bigger than all the pain she had endured. She had never expected anything from the world. Not kindness. Not respect. But today, she would take it. The crowd grew quieter as she stepped forward, closer to the Alpha King. Her steps were measured, not out of fear, but of purpose. She did not need to hide anymore. She had nothing left to lose. "I am not afraid of you," she declared, her voice steady and strong. "Not of your words. Not of your power. You want to break me? You've already failed." The silence in the room was deafening. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Alexander Thorne, the Alpha King, did not move, but his eyes followed her every step, a flicker of something unreadable flashing across his face. Emily's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to respond, to do something, anything to prove her wrong. And then, with a suddenness that took her by surprise, he stepped forward, his figure looming over her. The council members fell back, intimidated by his sheer presence. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his slow, deliberate footsteps. The tension in the air crackled, and Emily held her ground, unwilling to back down. As he reached her, his voice finally broke the silence. "You've never been weak, Emily White," he said, his tone low, yet filled with authority. "And I've been watching you." His words hit her like a wave, and for the first time, she saw the respect in his eyes, the acknowledgement of her strength. The Alpha King stood before her, not as a ruler above her, but as someone who recognized her for what she was, more than just an omega. She had always been more. And now, in front of everyone who had ever doubted her, she was ready to claim it. The room was silent as Emily stood before Alpha King Alexander, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she didn't flinch. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, locked with his. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a weak omega. She didn't feel invisible. The energy in the room had shifted. The other council members, once eager to mock her, now stood still, unsure of what to make of this sudden change. They had expected her to crumble, to beg for mercy, but instead, she stood her ground, her spirit unbroken. Alexander's silver eyes never left hers. He studied her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the intensity of his gaze that made her pulse race. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped, leaving only the two of them in this charged space. She had expected to feel fear, to shrink beneath his power. But all she felt now was a strange calm. The whispers of the crowd faded into the background as the connection between her and the Alpha King deepened. "You are stronger than they gave you credit for," Alexander finally spoke, his voice low and commanding. His words sent a ripple through her, stirring something deep within her that she had long since buried. For so long, she had been told she was nothing. But in that moment, the Alpha King was acknowledging her. "No one has ever dared to challenge me like you have," he continued, his voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of his authority. "Most would have fallen to their knees, begging for mercy. But you." He paused, taking a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You stand tall, unbroken, even in the face of certain defeat." His words stirred something fierce within her. She had spent so long being silenced, ignored, dismissed. But now, in this moment, she was seen. For the first time, someone was recognizing her strength. Not as an Omega, not as someone weaker, but as someone powerful in her own right. Emily's breath hitched, but she steadied herself, unwilling to let him see the effect his words had on her. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady, though her heart beat faster. "Not of your title. Not of your power. I'm here to be seen for who I am, not who they think I should be." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something in his gaze that she couldn't quite place. But instead of retreating, he stepped even closer, until he was standing just inches from her. The air between them seemed to crackle with energy. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped entirely, as if they were the only two people left in the world. "You challenge everything I stand for," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I see the fire in you. The strength you've always had." His words were a declaration, not just to her, but to the entire room. Emily's heart raced, but she did not back down. She had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. "I challenge because I know my worth," she replied, her voice filled with conviction. "And I know it's time for the world to see it too." The room was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Alexander studied her, his eyes piercing through her with an intensity that left her breathless. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice firm and commanding. "You're right," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "The world will see you for who you truly are. And I'll make sure of it." As the words left his mouth, Emily felt a shift, a deep, unspoken connection forming between them. She had challenged him, and in return, he had recognized her. For the first time, she wasn't just the weak Omega who had been cast aside. She was someone worthy of being seen, of being heard. And in that moment, the Alpha King had claimed her as his equal. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity, but Emily held her ground, standing tall in the presence of Alpha King Alexander. The intensity of his gaze weighed heavily on her, but she didn't look away. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the powerful men around her. She wasn't afraid of Alexander Thorne. He had seen her for who she truly was, and that recognition sparked something deep within her. As he stood before her, his piercing silver eyes never left hers, and the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. The weight of his authority was undeniable, but there was something else, something gentler in the way he looked at her. It was almost as if he was seeing something he hadn't expected, something beyond the surface. She had always been told she was nothing, that she was weak and unworthy. But now, standing in the heart of the tribunal, she could feel the shift. The world was seeing her, for the first time, as someone worthy of respect. "You've changed the course of everything," Alexander's voice was low, the power in his words unmistakable. "And now, you will stand beside me, not beneath me." His words were not a command but a promise. For a moment, Emily could only stand there, absorbing the weight of his words. She had expected to fight for her place in the world, but now it seemed as though the world was giving her a place. A place at his side. The room was still, the air heavy with anticipation, as the council members watched in silence. They had expected this trial to break her. They had expected her to crumble under the pressure. But Emily had stood firm, unyielding, and now they were witnessing the beginning of something else, a new chapter. Alexander stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, but there was no threat in his movements. He stood beside her, his eyes softening as he spoke again. "I see the strength in you, Emily White. Not just the strength to survive, but the strength to lead." The words took her by surprise, but they felt true. She had never seen herself as a leader. She had only ever wanted to be seen, to be heard. But now, in the presence of this powerful man, she realized something. She didn't need to ask for respect anymore. She had earned it. "And I will stand beside you," she said, her voice steady, the conviction clear in every word. "Together, we will build a future where no one like me is ever cast aside again." Alexander's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. He reached out, his hand brushing hers in a gesture that was almost tender. "You are more than I ever imagined," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "And I will never let you fall." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was clear. She was no longer the weak Omega, no longer the girl who had been cast aside by the world. She was his equal, his partner. As the room around them remained silent, Emily felt a shift within herself. She had challenged everything. And now, she had found a place where she truly belonged. A place by his side. A place where she would never again have to prove her worth. The world had changed, and so had she. With Alexander standing beside her, she knew that nothing could break her. She was no longer the forgotten Omega. She was Emily White, and the Alpha King had claimed her as his mate. The weight of the Alpha King's words lingered in the air, but Emily did not falter. There was no longer fear or uncertainty within her, only the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered their true strength. Standing beside Alexander Thorne, she felt the power of the moment, the promise of something greater. The room, once filled with skepticism and judgment, now buzzed with a different energy. The council members who had watched her with disdain now held their breath, unsure of how to react. Alexander's declaration had shifted everything. He had chosen her. Not because of her rank, her status, or her power, but because of who she was. For the first time, Emily felt as if she truly mattered. She glanced at Alexander, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken understanding. No more games, no more pretenses. He had seen her for who she was, and in return, she had come to see herself with new eyes. The Omega who had once been overlooked, ignored, and cast aside was now standing at the side of the most powerful man in the realm. Emily felt a surge of pride, but more than that, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. She was no longer just a symbol of weakness. She had the power to change the world around her, to shape her own destiny. "You've already done the impossible," Alexander said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "I never expected to meet someone who could challenge everything I believed in, but you've done that. And more." His words, though simple, carried the weight of truth. Emily had never thought of herself as someone capable of such a change, but standing here, beside him, she realized she had more power than she had ever known. "And I will stand by your side," she replied, her voice steady with determination. "Not just as your mate, but as your equal. Together, we will change things. Together, we will make sure no one like me is ever cast aside again." The council, still silent, watched in awe as Emily's words echoed through the room. She wasn't just speaking to Alexander, she was speaking to everyone who had ever doubted her, who had ever tried to break her. She had found her place in the world, and nothing would take it away from her. Alexander's gaze softened, his hand reaching for hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "You've already proven you belong here, Emily," he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. "And I'll make sure the world sees it too." The promise in his voice was undeniable, and in that moment, Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same again. She was no longer just the quiet, broken Omega who had been pushed aside. She was Emily White, and the Alpha King had chosen her as his mate, his partner in everything. The council members, once full of skepticism and judgment, now stood in stunned silence. The power in the room had shifted. And for the first time, Emily felt truly seen, truly heard. The weight of her past seemed to fall away, replaced by the undeniable truth that she was worthy. Alexander's presence beside her was a constant reminder of the journey ahead. They had come this far together, and now, nothing could stand in their way. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the future settling in her chest. The world had changed, and she was ready to embrace it. The power of the Alpha King and the strength of the Omega had come together, and together, they would change everything. The days following Emily's declaration were filled with a sense of anticipation, not just for her, but for the entire kingdom. The air itself seemed to hum with the possibility of change. Alexander's presence was constant, a steady anchor in a world that had never seemed so uncertain. Together, they worked tirelessly, side by side, forging a new path for those like Emily, those who had been cast aside, those who had been told they were nothing. With every passing day, Emily grew stronger, more confident in her place beside Alexander. She was no longer the quiet, broken Omega who had once lived in the shadows. She was Emily White. And the world was starting to see her for who she truly was. The council members, who had once looked at her with disdain, now watched her with a newfound respect. Some of them, those who had been the loudest in their mockery, even began to speak to her with a level of deference that was hard to ignore. Emily could feel the shift, not just in their words, but in their eyes. She had become a force to be reckoned with. And yet, it was not the respect of the council that filled her with the greatest sense of accomplishment. It was the way Alexander looked at her. The way his eyes softened when he saw her, the quiet pride that filled his gaze when she spoke. She had earned his respect, not through her obedience or her compliance, but through her strength, her conviction, and her willingness to stand up for what was right. She had challenged him, and in return, he had recognized her as his equal. As the days passed, Emily found herself growing closer to Alexander in ways she hadn't expected. There was no romance between them, not yet, at least, but there was an undeniable connection. They worked together, strategizing and planning, their conversations growing deeper with each passing day. Emily began to understand him, not just as a king, but as a man. She saw the weight of his responsibilities, the burden of his title, and the quiet loneliness that seemed to haunt him. It was a loneliness that Emily understood all too well. For much of her life, she had been alone, dismissed by those around her. But now, standing beside Alexander, she no longer felt the sting of isolation. In him, she had found not just a partner, but a companion, someone who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time in her life. One evening, as the two of them stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, Emily turned to him, her heart full. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what the world would be like if we could change it all?" Alexander's gaze softened as he looked at her, his hand resting on the railing. "Every day," he replied. "But change doesn't come easily. It takes time, effort, and sacrifice." Emily nodded, understanding the truth of his words. She had spent her life waiting for change, hoping for someone to notice her, to see her for what she was worth. But now, with Alexander by her side, she knew the change was within their grasp. "And what if we fail?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We won't," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Because we're in this together. And that makes all the difference." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, comforting and reassuring. She had always been afraid of failure, of falling short, of not being enough. But now, with Alexander at her side, she felt something new, a sense of possibility. She was no longer afraid of what the future held. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and together, they would build a new world. A world where no one like her was ever cast aside again. Emily looked out over the kingdom, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance like stars. She felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. And with Alexander beside her, she knew that nothing would ever hold her back again. The days turned into weeks, and the kingdom began to change. The once divided and fractured council now worked more cohesively, united by the shared vision of a future where power was not defined by birthright alone. Emily and Alexander, side by side, spearheaded this transformation, pushing for reforms that would benefit the overlooked and forgotten members of their society. Despite the challenges they faced, Emily found herself growing more confident in her role, more comfortable in the space she had claimed beside Alexander. Every day, she was reminded of how far she had come from the quiet, broken Omega who had once been discarded like an afterthought. Yet, the path forward was not without its obstacles. There were those within the kingdom who resisted change, who clung to the old ways, unwilling to let go of the power they had held for so long. Emily had encountered resistance before, but this time it felt different. She was no longer fighting for survival. She was fighting for something far greater, for a future where no one was left behind. As the weeks passed, Emily and Alexander grew closer, their partnership evolving into something unspoken, yet undeniably powerful. It wasn't just the shared vision of the future that bound them, it was the quiet understanding between them, the bond that had formed in the aftermath of their trials. They no longer needed words to communicate. A glance, a touch, was enough to convey their thoughts and feelings. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the courtyard of the castle, Emily found herself standing alone on the balcony, her eyes lost in the horizon. The sky was a canvas of colors, shades of orange, pink, and purple blending together in perfect harmony. It was a scene that always brought her peace, reminding her of the beauty that still existed in the world. "You look lost in thought," Alexander's voice broke through her reverie, warm and familiar. She turned to face him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Just taking in the view," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "It is," he agreed, stepping closer to her. He stood beside her, his presence grounding, as always. For a moment, neither of them spoke, simply enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's company. The world outside the castle walls may have been filled with uncertainty, but in this moment, Emily felt a sense of peace she had never known before. "I never imagined this life," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "I never imagined being here, standing beside you, with everything we've fought for starting to become a reality." Alexander's gaze softened as he looked at her, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But here we are." Emily's heart swelled at the simplicity of his words. She had never thought she would find a place where she truly belonged, but now, with Alexander by her side, she knew she had found it. Together, they had not only changed the kingdom, they had changed each other. "I don't know what the future holds," Emily continued, her eyes meeting his, "but I know one thing for certain. I want to face it with you." Alexander reached out, his hand finding hers, a silent promise exchanged between them. "We will face it together," he said, his voice firm and reassuring. "Always." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily felt the weight of her past lift from her shoulders, replaced by the knowledge that, with Alexander, she had a future worth fighting for. Together, they would build that future, side by side, no longer as ruler and subject, but as equals, bound by a shared purpose. And for the first time in her life, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the days passed, Emily and Alexander continued their work, each day bringing them closer to the world they were building together. The castle, once a symbol of power and separation, had now become a place of unity and progress. Their shared vision was beginning to take shape, not just within the walls of the kingdom but in the hearts of the people as well. Emily often found herself lost in thought as she looked out over the lands they were striving to change. It wasn't just about the policies, the laws, or the territories. It was about people. The quiet voices that had once been ignored now had a place. Alexander had always ruled with strength, but now he was learning, as Emily had, the strength in listening, in acknowledging the lives of those who had been silenced for too long. "You're quiet tonight," Alexander remarked one evening as they walked through the garden of the castle. The air was crisp, the first hints of autumn beginning to show in the changing colors of the leaves. Emily glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "about everything we've accomplished." Alexander nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And about everything we still have to do," he added. Emily laughed quietly, the sound light in the cool evening air. Of course, she agreed, her smile widening. There's always more to do. They continued their walk in silence for a while, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet the only sound between them. The moon was rising, casting a silvery glow over the garden, and Emily found herself at peace in the stillness. She had never known this kind of tranquility before. The world outside the castle walls was still full of uncertainties, but here, in this moment, with Alexander by her side, it felt as if everything was possible. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you hadn't come here? Alexander asked after a while. His voice was low, and when Emily turned to look at him, she saw a faint hint of vulnerability in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. I've never thought about it, she said honestly, her gaze softening. I suppose I was too busy surviving. Too busy hoping for something better. And now you've found it, Alexander replied, his voice steady but filled with something she couldn't quite place. There was a pause, as if the weight of his words lingered between them. Emily turned to face him fully, her heart swelling with emotion. I found it with you, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's gaze softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. It was just the two of them, standing beneath the stars, sharing a moment that was as quiet and simple as it was profound. I never thought I would find someone like you, Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of years of uncertainty, of battles fought and lost. Someone who would make me believe in something more than power. Emily stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. You don't have to do it alone anymore, she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. I'm here. And together, we can make it work. Alexander's expression softened further, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to truly believe her. The weight of his responsibilities had always been his alone, but now, with Emily by his side, he could see a future where they shared everything. The joy, the struggles, the victories, and the losses. They would face them all together. Together, he repeated, the word taking root in both of their hearts. It wasn't just a promise. It was a new beginning. As they stood there in the garden, the moon rising higher in the sky, they both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them head-on, with the strength of their bond and the certainty that they were no longer alone. For the first time, Emily felt truly at peace, and she knew that this was only the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The castle was alive with activity as Emily and Alexander prepared for the next phase of their journey. What had once been a place of isolation and power was now a hub of unity and change. The reforms they had set into motion were starting to take shape, not just in law, but in the hearts of the people. It wasn't just the council that had shifted, it was the very soul of the kingdom. Emily felt the change deep within her as well. She had found not just a partner in Alexander, but a sense of purpose that had eluded her for so long. Together, they were building something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. Yet, as the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the sense that they were on the cusp of something even bigger. There was still so much to do, so many battles to fight, and so many voices that needed to be heard. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had Alexander by her side, and that was more than enough to face whatever the future held. One evening, as they sat together in the grand hall of the castle, surrounded by maps and documents, Emily looked up from the papers scattered before them and met Alexander's gaze. Do you ever think about what will happen when this is all over? She asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. Alexander paused, his pen hovering over a map as he considered her question. I try not to, he said honestly. I focus on what we can do now, on what we're building together. The future will come in time, but we have to stay focused on the present. Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. I know, she replied softly. But sometimes it's hard not to wonder. Will everything truly change? Will people really see us as equals? Alexander set down his pen and turned to face her fully. His gaze was steady, his expression serious yet filled with a quiet confidence that put her at ease. The change we're creating isn't about how others see us, he said, his voice firm but gentle. It's about how we see ourselves. We've already started the work, Emily. The kingdom is changing, and so are we. No matter what happens, we will always stand together. The certainty in his words filled her with a warmth that seemed to spread through her entire being. She had never believed in fate, never believed that anything was set in stone. But now, standing by his side, she couldn't help but believe that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together. The days that followed were filled with moments of quiet reflection, moments where Emily and Alexander would pause and simply be. The weight of the world, of their responsibilities, was always present, but in these quiet moments, they found peace. It was in the laughter they shared, the small glances they exchanged, and the way they communicated without words that Emily knew they had something truly special. As the sun set one evening, casting a golden light over the castle grounds, Emily found herself standing alone in the courtyard, her thoughts drifting to the future once more. The path ahead was uncertain, and yet, for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She wasn't alone. She had Alexander. She had herself. And that was enough. Are you ready for what comes next? Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, watching her with that quiet intensity she had come to admire. She smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. Yes, she said, her voice steady and confident. I'm ready. And in that moment, with the setting sun casting its last rays over the kingdom, Emily knew that they were ready, too. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, and together, they would build a future that no one would ever forget.